Vikings had the technology to sweep through North America, but the reason they never colonized is terrifyingly simple. Now, have you ever wondered who these legendary Vikings actually were? Just picture this. It's the late 8th century, and a group of Scandinavian visionaries are about to change the world. I'm talking about the Norse warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, who were basically the original adventure capitalists. They weren't just some random dudes with horned helmets, but sophisticated seafarers with crazy navigation skills and a culture that was way more complex than simply to raid and pillage. Contrary to Hollywood's portrayal of Vikings, they weren't just warriors. They were farmers, traders, craftsmen, and total tech innovators of their time. They could run a farm, build incredible longships, create intricate jewelry, and still have time to explore unknown territories. These guys were the ultimate multitaskers. Their society was surprisingly democratic, with things like the assembly, where community decisions were made. Women had more rights than in many contemporary societies, and their social structure was way more nuanced than simply one big strong man making all of the decisions. So here's the million-dollar question. Could these Norse adventurers have turned North America into Viking Central? The short answer is that it's totally possible, but with some major asterisks. They'd already proven they could survive in tough environments like Greenland, so North America wasn't entirely out of their league. There is archaeological evidence in what is now Newfoundland and Labrador that shows they definitely made it to the continent around 1000 AD, and they hung around for a while. But colonization, that's a whole different ballgame, and we're about to find out why it did not happen. But what if it did? Hypothetically speaking, of course. A fun game of what if never hurt anybody. So let's imagine a Viking settlement nestled along the Newfoundland coast, with their iconic longhouses fortified against potential conflicts. They would likely choose a spot near water for fishing, with access to timber for ship repairs and construction. Vikings were intentional campers, so they would strategically choose a spot to settle after meticulously planning their approach. It was less random invasion and more carefully calculated expansion. The location had to nourish both the people and the livestock. This colony would be a thriving North outpost where Scandinavian farming techniques meet North American scenery. Additionally, they'd probably establish small, interconnected communities similar to their Greenland model and live in close-knit neighborhoods. Wooden structures, advanced boat-building facilities, solid trade networks with local indigenous populations would be their homes if they played their cards right. We're talking about a potential multicultural frontier where Norse innovation meets indigenous knowledge. Colonization isn't just about showing up and planting a flag. These Norse adventurers would have needed a smart combination of resources, adaptability, and serious survival skills. It wasn't just about being tough, it was about being smart, flexible, and genuinely committed to the long-term settlement. The secret sauce would be sturdy population numbers, sustainable food production, and good relationships with the already existing indigenous groups. They would also need technology that could handle North America's challenging environments. Successful colonization would also have required something Vikings were already pros at: adaptability. They would need to learn local fishing techniques, understand agricultural possibilities, create trade relationships, and basically become part of the culture. Now let's move from hypotheticals and get into the reality of how it all went down. It's around 1000 AD, and the Vikings cruised into L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. They're the OG explorers, but here's the kicker. They dropped by, looked around, and they decided that actually they were good. But why was that the case? First, in order to colonize, you need numbers. Huge numbers. Something the Vikings didn't have at the time. We'll get into the archaeological facts and history momentarily, but at the time, the Viking world wasn't exactly bursting with spare people, and their Greenland settlements were tiny. I'm talking about a population so small that they couldn't exactly launch a full-scale, let's take over a continent mission. Imagine trying to colonize the massive landmass that is North America with your extended family and a few cousins. That's not going to happen. The second reason for no colonization is that their culture was almost the opposite of the Native Americans. It's also important to note that indigenous people were not rolling out the welcome mats and dancing happy songs. Historical sagas tell us these encounters were heated, and violent clashes meant the Vikings quickly realized this wasn't going to be a smooth land grab. Another reason was that the Vikings weren't looking to build suburban neighborhoods. They were more like medieval resource hunters seeking timber and fish in a quick grab-and-go style. They weren't in to seek a permanent settlement. They were the original hit-and-run explorers of the medieval world. Their trading opportunities were also pretty much non-existent. The Vikings showed up with goods, but the tribes weren't all too interested. It's pretty much like showing up to a potluck with stale crackers. Nobody's impressed, and no valuable exchange meant no real motivation to stick around. And how about Newfoundland's climate? Major buzzkill for agriculture. It is cold and unpredictable, basically the opposite of a Viking's dream vacation spot. Try growing crops when your fingers are freezing and the ground is harder than your grandfather's stories about walking uphill both ways. For human food like bread and drinks like ale, they grew barley, rye, oats, wheat, millet, peas, and linseed. For their livestock, they grew hay. All these need a season or two when the sun is out. They just could not survive. Besides the lack of food, the varying temperatures would also affect their sheep, cattle, and goats. Sure, adaptation is possible, but that might have happened way later after they had lost many to the extremes. Even though it's minor, the risk did not seem worth it. Here comes another issue: supply chain interruptions. Just imagine trying to run a colony thousands of miles from your main supply depot. One bad storm, and suddenly you're cut off from everything. The Vikings' Greenland connection was their lifeline, and North America? Too risky, too far. Now, Vikings were adventure seekers, not suburban developers. Exploration was their jam, not long-term real estate investment. So, it could be said that taking over North America was not even on their minds. Another disadvantage that Vikings had to face was that the local populations were deeply connected to their environment and had survival skills the Vikings didn't. Without the ability to learn or trade effectively, the Norse settlers were out of their depth. Even as explorers, the Vikings were really not that great at learning other people's survival skills. Indigenous fishing techniques, local agriculture methods, they had their own ways. Unfortunately, their ways were not the best way in this new environment. The Viking population was already stretched thin across their established settlements in Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland. Adding North America to the mix would have been like juggling flaming swords. Cool in theory, disastrous in practice. They needed to consolidate, not expand further. Sources suggest that anywhere from only a few dozen to 100 Vikings had made their way to North America. Now, Greenland itself was barely hanging on. The Norse settlers there faced harsh winters, limited resources, and isolation. Establishing a new colony in an even more distant and hostile land wasn't a gamble they could afford, even if they had wanted to. Moreover, exploration wasn't cheap. Longships were technological marvels, but maintaining and manning them required substantial resources: food, fresh water, and workforce. The Vikings likely realized the cost of sustaining transatlantic expeditions outweighed the potential benefits of making back and forth trips to their potential colony. Their ships were perfect for quick rapids and short-term voyages, but not ideal for moving large groups of settlers or transporting heavy supplies across the Atlantic. The challenges of resupplying a distant colony would have been insurmountable. It just didn't make sense. Now, the Viking Age was about seizing opportunities, but North America wasn't unclaimed territory. It already had its occupants who weren't happy with invaders. Indigenous populations already in America were well established, and the Vikings weren't equipped to coexist or overpower them. The Viking sagas suggest that they may have struggled with the seasonal cycles in North America. Winters were harsher than expected, and summers may have been too short for sustainable farming. The animals would die, and the plants would not have enough time to ripen. Another downside might have been the fact that the Vikings had encountered unfamiliar diseases in North America, further discouraging them from staying. Disease exchange between indigenous peoples and Norse settlers could have been catastrophic for both groups. Now, imagine being thousands of miles from your homeland, surrounded by unfamiliarity. The psychological toll on the Vikings must have been enormous, and this might have made the prospect of staying untenable. Homesickness isn't a new concept, and their people probably would have suffered from it. Now, the Viking name for North America was Vinland, suggesting a fertile land, but it may have been a marketing ploy to entice settlers. The reality didn't live up to the name's promise, and they thought it wasn't really worth it. During the time of Viking exploration, a warmer climate may have initially made Greenland and North America seem appealing, but this period of relative warmth was fleeting, leaving them unprepared for the harsher conditions that followed. While the Vikings were drawn to North America for its timber, transporting it back to Greenland or Scandinavia wasn't a simple task. They had to cut trees down, move to the shores, load them on the boats, then transport. The logistical headaches likely outweighed the benefits, and unlike later European explorers, the Vikings didn't find gold, spices, or other riches in North America. Without a clear economic incentive, their interest waned, and they didn't really see the point of taking over the continent. However, would they have settled if they did? The Vikings did not have a centralized government or large armies to support their efforts like later colonists. They were on their own, and that isolation proved too much. If you did not have an edge from external support back then, without numbers, you wouldn't rule. Now, evidence does show us that Vikings were present in North America in 1012 AD, and this represents the first known point when humans encircled the globe. The only confirmed Norse site is Les Olmedos in Newfoundland. However, there has been extensive field campaigns conducted, and evidence now shows that this was just a base camp for the Vikings and that other locations, including ones further south, were explored. However, the frequency and duration of Norse activity in North America is unconfirmed. Sources such as stylistic analysis of the architectural remains and a handful of artifacts, interpretations of the Icelandic sagas, oral histories that were only written down centuries later, and radiocarbon analysis has led to more than 150 dates being obtained. 55 of these dates relate to the Viking occupation. However, the date ranges provided by these sources extend across and beyond the entire Viking Age, which is 793 AD to 1066 AD. So it is possible that Vikings were in North America at any time between those dates, but we do know for sure that they were present in 1012 AD. And while the Vikings' primary desire was exploration, 16th century European settlers had a vastly different agenda when it came to colonization. This explains why later Europeans were so much more successful at settling than the Vikings. You see, resources such as timber and fur were scarce in Greenland colonies. The Vikings were exploring in order to assist their already established colonies in Greenland and Iceland. 16th century settlers from Britain, Spain, and France, on the other hand, were exploring for the sake of economic gain. We all know the story that Christopher Columbus sailed west in hopes of finding a quicker route to Asia instead of navigating around the African continent. Then he landed on the island of the Caribbean and thought that he had made it to East Asia. And alas, the New World was formed. Once word of the New World spread, countries like the Netherlands, Spain, France, and Britain sent explorers to the New World. They were more motivated than the Vikings were. The Spanish were in it for, quote, God, gold, and glory, quote. France focused on establishing commercially viable trading posts to supply Europe with more fur. The Dutch were interested in economic opportunities, while the British were also lured by potential riches, but many also wanted to break free from the Church of England and to live and worship according to their beliefs. With more motivation and improvements in shipbuilding and navigation, it's no surprise why Europeans were able to colonize the way they did. The Vikings, on the other hand, were primarily focused on exploration for the benefit of their pre-existing colonies, and did not have the manpower to launch a full-scale settlement at the time. The sagas that chronicle Viking adventures in North America are part history, part legend. It's possible the challenges they faced were exaggerated or underplayed, depending on who was telling the tale. As we all know, there have been records of tale twisting, so it's no surprise. Viking exploration of North America was likely more of a scouting mission than a full-fledged colonization attempt. Once they saw the challenges, they decided to move on. It seemed like the hustle wasn't worth it. By the time they reached North America, the Viking Age was already winding down their reign. Internal conflicts and the rise of centralized kingdoms in Scandinavia shifted focus away from exploration. They were now focusing on dipping their roots into stability that exploration doesn't offer. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.